There's a new poll out from the Associated Press discussing Americans' viewpoints on GLP-1 medications like Ozempic and Mounjaro. It looks into what Americans think of adults taking it, teenagers taking it, whether you have obesity, not having obesity, and whether Medicare should cover this at all. And the results, to me, are fascinating. Over half of the US population actually has a positive impression of Americans taking GLP-1 medications to deal with the disease of obesity. To me, that's a victory because those of us who have been creating content in here know that wasn't the case 6 months, 9 months, a year ago. That was not the sense that we got. Only 2 in 10 Americans think that's a bad idea. That's the trolls that we're talking about. It's 1 in 5 people in the United States have this negative impression, and that is who's in these comments making all of these nasty comments. Now, Americans' opinions are more nuanced than that. 6 in 10 think it's a bad idea to take these medications if you're not dealing with a disease of obesity. So there's lots of other things these medications cover, and the sense right now is there's diabetes, there's obesity, and that's it. And we all know there's a lot more metabolic disease that these things cover. And we're finding so many more new things like sleep apnea and Alzheimer's. So it's going to be interesting to see how Americans' views continue to evolve on these medications. There's also a lot of controversy around teenagers taking these medications. Over half of people think it's a bad idea for teenagers to be taking these medications. Now, the American Association of Pediatrics, I think that's the name of the organization, actually thinks it's a good idea. So that's telling us that Americans' viewpoints with science are not quite there yet. But what was most surprising to me is that Americans seem to get the access issue. Over half of Americans think it's a good idea for Medicare to cover these medications. And that's a big conversation going on in the government right now. It started with the Biden administration. It's being discussed under the Trump administration. And it's going to be fascinating to see where this all goes. As I've talked about a lot, the Trump administration is probably going to have a fairly favorable viewpoint to this because its base is the people taking the medications the most. It turns out that people who take these medications the most live in the South. It's also where the biggest rates of obesity in the country are. And so access to these medications is going to be really important to Trump's base. So it'll be interesting to see what he does around this, especially as most Americans actually think Medicare covering these medications is a good thing. And frankly, so does Big Pharma, because Big Pharma gets a much larger base if Medicare does that. But the cost to our government initially is going to be really high. But as anyone who's on these meds knows, you take a lot less medications, you need a lot less surgery, and you have a lot less health problems over the long term if you take them. So the long-term prognosis is probably pretty good, although studies from Congress continue to not show that yet. So I'm super excited to see the rates of approval for Americans with obesity taking these medications. I think that's a really positive sign. There's a lot more work to do around building Americans' nuance on these medications. But what this does tell me is that the overriding media narrative that these are for the celebrities and that there's all these rare side effects that you really should be scared of, that narrative is broken through. As something like 1 in 6 or 1 in 8 Americans have tried one of these medications now. So most people know someone who's taken them. And a lot of people are being public about the fact that they're taking them. And for those of us that are, we are opening people's eyes. It's like a coming out process. And what we're doing is working. So I'm super excited by this poll. Just to tell you up front, the sample size was 1,147 people. The margin of error rate is 3.9%. But this is a pretty good sample size to get a pretty good idea of what Americans think about GLP-1 medication usage in 2025.